Hi, my name's Alissa Romano, and I am one of our co-directors at the Lehigh Valley Health Network, which now has recently become and joined forces with Jefferson University. So it's a really exciting time up in Allentown to combine forces with Jefferson, and we are plugging ahead with even new ventures in research. So what we're going to talk about today, is the current state. So, you know, I really want to empower you guys and support you guys as you navigate ALS. I can understand how difficult this journey is, and I want to let you guys know that you're not alone. I want to let you guys know what opportunities there are in research and finding research and finding a cure for ALS. So we're going to kind of talk through research. We're going to kind of dumb this down and even just talk about what is research. What are the different types of research that are going on? What is an observational study? What is a clinical trial? What are these phases I hear about? We're going to talk about the clinical trials then at Lehigh Valley Health Network. We're involved in 2 clinical trials right now, as well as an expanded access program up at Lehigh Valley. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is other alternative research availabilities and other websites to kind of do research. I think that's really a hard thing for our patients to really go through is the World Wide Web. It is so wide and vast, and it can be really overwhelming to find good sources. And so I want to empower you guys to use Wikipedia and to use these sources, but to use them in a responsible manner and to find good sites that you can trust. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. You know, I am so grateful to ALS United, but I'm also going to talk about some other ALS groups as well that are doing some really great work too. So we all know this. ALS is a really challenging diagnosis to understand, to diagnose, and to treat. Participation from people who have been diagnosed is the key. You know, this is what is going to help us to find that cure, okay? And there's a variety of ways that you guys can help. There's clinical trials, there's participation in observational trials, there's donating tissues, there's biorepository banks, and this is all that, you know, I want to go through today as part of a greater understanding of what it means to be a part of ALS research. So why is it important? You know, if you join a clinical trial, you may be entitled to trying a new treatment option that's not yet available to the public. During the clinical trial, you would be monitored frequently. But I want to take a step back here. You know, we know that in ALS, there is not a cure at this point. There are some good drugs on the market that can slow progression, but our hope with research is to find that cure, to find that end point that we can reverse ALS. And that is what research is all about. But what I want to be mindful to always tell my patients is that you have to think that you're advancing research for the next generation of patients. And that's sometimes hard to kind of grasp and understand. And so I want you to understand that you're helping these researchers make scientific discoveries for the people that are living with ALS. For many patients, this can be particularly empowering. They're making a difference. They're making a crucial difference in fighting ALS. And I think it's also really important is that, especially in Philadelphia, we come from a diverse patient population, right? We are from all walks of life, and that's what makes the Delaware and Lehigh Valley so wonderful. But it's really important in research is that we're not looking at all of one people and one subset of people. For too long, we were looking at research that were, you know, kind of aimed at, you know, this middle-aged white men, right? And we need to expand that to include women, to include other ethnic backgrounds, to include other minorities, to include, Asian populations that have this subset of ALS, to greater understand the biomarkers that's involved with this disease pathogenesis. And so with your involvement, we can develop treatments that actually work and that actually empower a cure. But I also want to be mindful that it can be exhausting. It can be a lot of time and energy. Most clinical trials involve weekly appointments, sometimes monthly appointments, sometimes weekly, depending on. Observational trials, which we'll talk about a little further, typically have a little bit fewer appointments. And if you have a busy schedule or a lot of other responsibilities, it can be difficult to make that trip to a clinical site and to be monitored as frequently as needed. And some clinical trials will reimburse you for the travel and the parking costs, or provide you some stipend of some sort. And I want to be mindful, no study should ever ask you to cover a cost, okay? You should not be paying to be enrolled in a study. But often these clinical stipends are minimal and nominal. And so it can take a lot of energy and a lot of alignment with schedules and alignment with caregivers and coordination with transportation and figuring out how to get the van here on time, et cetera, to make all of this work. I also want to say that, this is an option, and I want to empower everyone to look into this option, but please know that every clinical site that I know of, and I know I'm speaking for a lot more than just myself, but we're just pleased as punch that you come to a multidisciplinary clinic, and that is enough for us. So research is the next step, but I really do want to just let you know that not everyone does have to participate in research, and you should never feel pressured to do something in this caliber. This is an extra step. So before clinical studies happen, I actually used to work at Merck & Company way back when, before I was even a doctor. And I worked in preclinical research. And so what we were doing there, I was not working in ALS at that time. I was working on the HPV virus back then. But we were looking at clinical markers. And so what happens is we're doing research on molecules and in Petri dishes to see if there is a difference in cell lines that can stop the progression of these diseases. And so that's the first step, is that these really smart PhDs that are working in a biotech company or in a small lab attached to a university arm are doing these preclinical studies to develop these biomarkers. And once these Petri dishes kind of expand and we have a good marker, we move on to animal models and kind of looking at how this affects in an animal subject, okay? So the next step in research. After that, there is a pilot trial, okay? So a few small people will be enrolled and to kind of look at, does this seem to be working in a patient population? And then there is the clinical trial that begins. And it is a really encompassing state to be a part of. So what happens in clinical trials and what historically has happened is that it has been a sponsored clinical trial as part of either an industry like a Merck & Company or Amgen or GeneTech or some sort of pharmaceutical company, or it's part of a university arm that's working on this. And we go through a lot of regulatory steps to even start a clinical trial. So the FDA becomes involved. We're looking at making sure that all of the regulatory components are taken care of to make sure that we monitor subjects, meaning patients, in the safest way possible. So that first clinical trial is called a phase 1 clinical trial. And that's the first in human studies that's focused mainly on safety. Is this drug safe? This is given to a few people, less than 20 persons, and we're just really trying to figure out that no harm will be done, okay? This is a safe molecule, this is a safe drug, okay? Phase 2 clinical trials, now we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best dose? Do we give this medicine through an IV? Should we give it through a spinal tap? Should we give it from an oral dose? What is the best route for this drug to be absorbed in our body to have the best capability to fight ALS, okay? Phase 3 is typically the ones that most of my patients have heard about. These are larger enrollment sites. And we're looking at, is this drug efficacious in this dose? At this dose, in this route, is this working, okay? And the phase 4 clinical trials continue to kind of monitor the effectiveness and the safety of the drug after it has been approved, okay? So phase 3, then it gets approval from the FDA, and that goes on to phase 4 trials for further testing. So that is clinical trials. Those clinical trials involve a lot of coordination. You're going to a site to be monitored, to have your blood drawn, to go through rigorous tests, to test how this is affecting you. You're getting your manual muscle strength testing done. You're getting your breathing tests done, and all of these things. These are done typically starting off weekly, and then it goes to monthly. And then even after the study, after you receive the medication and the drug, it continues. You'll have some follow-up to make sure that we continue to follow up after you're not receiving the drug at the end of the study. The difference is, so there's a pedagogical difference, and there's also observational studies, okay?
Melissa, are you taking questions?
Yeah.
What's the average length, or is there a prescribed length of a clinical trial?
Great question. They are all different, and they are based on the start process of what that clinical trial is going to be. So a clinical trial could be a 20-week study. It could be a 2-year study. It is really at what either the pharmaceutical company or the primary investigator, the PI of that research, has found to say, this is what we're going to look at. We are going to look and see how this is affected after 20 weeks, after 6 months, et cetera. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences in a head-to-head trial versus a platform trial a little later, but that's a great question. And yes, please ask any question anytime. Just if I don't see your hand, just start speaking, okay? I'm pretty friendly. So an observational trial is slightly different. This requires a little less monitoring. You're not going into a clinic office as often. In these, you're more filling out surveys, okay? These can be more done at home. You're at your computer and you pull up a screen and they say, okay, do you want to be part of this observational study on breathlessness in ALS? And you would fill out this survey. Sometimes they'll have a nurse come to your house, and you can provide samples of blood or saliva or spinal fluid. Sometimes you'll go to the clinic if it's a spinal fluid. They're not going to do that at your house. I hope not, at least. But whereas a clinical trial involves trying a new drug or device, what an observational study is trying to figure out is we're trying to collect data that without trying to intervene in the progression of the disease. So we're trying to learn more about just the disease process itself and what's happening, okay? So eligibility is typically less strict and less stringent because we're not putting a medication or an experimental treatment into someone's body, okay? But they vary really widely. Some are completely remote. You never have to go into a clinic office to do these, and others involve some home visits, as I said. So who can participate in these? You know, as I said, it's less stringent in observational studies and a little bit more stringent in clinical trials. Well, how do I get involved? What do I need to do? And we talk a lot about, are you in an inclusion criteria? Or I'll say in the office, I need to check inclusion criteria. I need to check and see if you're excluded from this clinical trial. And so what we're doing is, in a clinical trial, they set up what everyone needs to have to be able to be eligible to be enrolled in the trial. So for instance, in an ALS, typically they're over the age of 18. They're not looking at a 2-year-old with ALS. That would be very rare, and we wouldn't know what to really do with those results if someone were to come with that. And so we exclude that. We say we're not going to look at that. We're going to look at this set number of patients. So they have to have certain characteristics. So this typically includes a lot of age. A lot of times it includes the time since you've been diagnosed. So sometimes I say, hey, this person, I'm diagnosing you today, but it looks like you've had symptoms since 5 years. You won't meet eligibility criteria for this particular research study. So it can be inclusive or exclusive, the time since diagnosis. Also, respiratory function is a lot of times part of our inclusion criteria. They, again, want to look at similar patient characteristics, and so they want to look at similar characteristics in how someone is breathing. And that can include someone, breathing without a ventilator or with a ventilator, and it all depends on the clinical trial that we're doing, but most of them actually exclude the ventilator patient population. And then also, other inclusion criteria can include, now we're getting down to the molecular level, right? We've done such research that we know, the 36 to 40 genes that are implicated in ALS that we know of today. So now we are doing a better job at figuring out not only what those genetic markers are, but what drugs are working well in those patient populations, and that's how we have tofersen, right? So that's a really big game changer that we have based on that specific gene mutation. So certain inclusion criteria is going to say you are going to need to have this specific gene mutation, or you can't have this specific gene mutation. And so that is part of the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. The other part that's part of sometimes the exclusion criteria is sometimes they say, okay, you're taking riluzole. That's fine. Or that's not okay. And so they'll say different medications can be used or not used. And it's not always ALS medications. It's often heart medications or antifungal creams. It can be anything. It's based on the properties of that experimental medication. So sometimes if they feel that molecule could be affecting the heart medications or something like that, if they work on the same or similar pathway, they'll say, hey, we don't want to include people that need to be on that medication because it might screw up with our data analysis here. So they'll exclude patients who are taking that medication. So that's why sometimes those medications, those other medications that you're like, why is this one excluded? That's why. We're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to come back to the clinical trials that Lehigh Valley is involved with, but I want to also talk about expanded access program and right to try, because I think this is very confusing. And what expanded access pathways are is they are an additional pathway of an experimental therapy, usually a medication, but doesn't always have to be, that otherwise a person would be ineligible for. So maybe your age is too young to be enrolled in this clinical trial, but through the expanded access program, you may be able to get this medication. What you need in an expanded access program is that this is done through the FDA, through the Federal Drug Administration. So this is the key point and the real change between, and the difference between right to try, which is a law we'll talk about in the next slide, and expanded access program, is the involvement in with the FDA. So as I said before, when we set up clinical trials, we have to put through all our regulatory steps through the FDA, through the government, and ensure that this is monitored safely through governmental programs, okay? And with the Expanded Access Program, this is similarly done, okay? So we still, it's usually typically a 2-page form, but we still go through this form and we say, okay, this will be monitored through the FDA, and we will look at this, this experimental trial and therapy for someone who would otherwise be ineligible for the clinical trial, okay? There's a couple different ways that we can do this. This has been around, honestly, since the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. That's when this first started with new HIV meds that were coming onto the market, that clinical trials, they were saving people's lives by expanding the access for HIV meds. So this has been around for a generation, right, since the 1980s. And back then, a lot of it was used in this single patient program, which is called a compassionate use program. And in that setting, we would say, you know, for this single person, we are asking the biopharma company or the therapy company that's involved in the clinical trial to expand the availability of the drug to this single patient, okay? There's also another larger size where we have an entire program of expanded access, and it's an expanded access program. And in that, we really work with the pharmaceutical companies or the primary investigator of the clinical trial to expand the access of the medication to a larger subset. So this is what we're doing in one of our clinical trials now. We've expanded the access for our combat trial for Ibrutolast, okay? And so we're saying, okay, if you don't fit this strict criteria, the pharmaceutical company is expanding this pool. We have enough medication to expand this pool to some people who are ineligible. Come to our program. We will monitor you just like a clinical trial through the FDA and do all the regulatory work so that you are also included in this, okay? So if you're interested, tell your ALS neurologist, okay? There are few EAP programs out there. It is hard to get into one. Why? Because pharmaceutical companies and other people, they make enough drug for the clinical trial, right? They're not making a surplus of this medication for general population use because it's still experimental. And that's the really hard part, is a lot of times it decreases the availability, just the supply and demand, okay? Simple economics of that. But other times it's that there's a lot of regulatory hurdles, is that sometimes all this paperwork and all this stuff from a small clinic, it can be overwhelming. But what we try to do at Lehigh Valley and all of our clinics, we really work well together through ALS United and come together with other clinics, and we share information and we share our patients, and we say, hey, we don't have an expanded access program, but you know who does? This site down the road. And so I think one of the most important things to share with you is, you know, we're all in this together and we're all wanting research together. So tell your ALS neurologist, and maybe we're not doing research at that particular site, but if you're interested in a particular EAP, we'll find someone who is participating in that EAP and we'll connect you and connect those dots, okay? Here, again, you'll still need to be medically and professionally monitored throughout this course, okay? Because this is an experimental drug and it goes through the federal regulatory systems here, okay? Other things I just kind of want to stress is that, you know, for an expanded access program, these are reserved for patients like yourself with ALS and life-threatening conditions, AIDS, HIV, things of that nature. This isn't for the toenail fungus, okay? There's not an expanded access for toenail fungus that I know of, maybe. But these are for serious life-threatening conditions, okay? And the other thing I want to say is that, you know, one of the other difficulties, oh yes, go ahead, I see this, I see it.
Expanded access program.
Yeah, so let me make sure I got that right. What you said was the EAP program seemed to be a flop because the pharmaceutical companies don't want to take the responsibility of all the regulatory hurdles. Is that, yes?
It's not going to be happening to the ALS patient.
Right. I think that's a very nuanced question. Who takes the responsibility? And I think it's a shared approach. I think it is a shared responsibility among the professional, the medical doctor, who is monitoring them and making sure we go through the regulatory hurdles to make sure it's safe. You know, in my clinical trial, every time someone has nausea or vomiting, it comes to me and they say, this patient's on this trial and they have nausea. Do you think that is because of the medication? And I have to make a determination to either stop that medication or to allow that continue, okay? So some of the responsibility is on me. Some of the decision-making is on the biologic or the pharmaceutical, biotech, university. And some of it is also on the FDA and how easy they make forms, right? And how easy they allow us to jump through the regulatory hurdles. We all know that it's not easy, right? Tax season is right around the corner. That was a bad joke. But, we all have a shared responsibility. But I agree. I think that we want to have further expanded access. It's really small. These pilot programs are small. They allow 100 more people to be expanded with this drug. It's not a lot, right? And what are those limitations? I think that's partly drug. It's partly the cost. Yeah, cost. Resources. I have to make time in my schedule to figure out the time for someone to come in, to have all this monitoring, to work with my research trial people. It's a whole lot of factors that go in that makes it burdensome, okay? The other interesting thing with this is, and this can kind of denote back to the pharmaceutical companies, is they will only allow EAPs if it will not interfere with the completion of their clinical trial. So if it directly competes with their trial, it's not going to be expanded. We have to expand it in a way that it's not going to directly compete. So that's why, okay, you cannot be enrolled in this clinical trial because you're too young or you're too old. Okay, well now that's not competing with the clinical trial, and so we can expand it in those realms. But if, say, a clinical trial just isn't enrolling anymore, right? But you would otherwise fit all criteria, then it directly competes with their trial, and they're not going to allow for expanded access. And that's another caveat to what you said. And here's Right to Try. So Right to Try is a law that was developed for, again, people who have life-threatening conditions, okay, very similar to the EAP program, okay? People who are eligible have to have that life-threatening disease. They have to have had exhausted all other approved treatment options and is ineligible or otherwise unable to participate in a clinical trial using the drug. A physician still needs to be involved. They can't just go to Canada and get the drug or from somewhere, from the internet, and get the drug and start using it. It still needs to be monitored. But the difference with Right to Try is that you do not need to go through the FDA. No one is monitoring your safety here except for the physician. So that Swiss cheese model of having a bigger regulatory, which I feel is safe. It covers my behalf in saying there is a greater assurance. The buck doesn't just stop with me, it stops with other people too, that if there is a safety problem that I don't know about in another patient with EAP, the FDA will let me know. With Right to Try, it's solely on the physician, okay? It is the physician, the pharmaceutical company, and the patient. The FDA is left out of the mix here. And what they did for this drug is they wanted to speed it up. And that's why they said, FDA, you're too slow. We're not going to wait around for you to approve our little silly little thing. We're going to do it without you guys. And it does speed up that process. But there's a caveat to that. With everything, it increases the risk because that safety net isn't there. So I want to be clear because, to be honest, I think EAP programs and right to try, the law, is really, really confusing. Go ahead.
So I'm going to assume that either in EAP or especially in right to try, that an external physician who's monitoring a patient who is getting the drug but not in the study, does that physician have access to any of the data that's being
collected
from the actual study, or is it, in neither instance, is there any information going to that monitoring physician about what's happening with the patients that are in the study?
Right. Yes. So most clinical trials are double-blind, or not most, but a lot of trials are double-blind placebo, which means I don't know the results of the study as they're going on. Basically, everyone is enrolled, the study goes on, and then we find out what happened, okay? So there are, as it goes on, we are given some information that as the study progresses, that there are some adverse events or something happened, and they will email us and let us know of those events. And with EAP, we would be, the FDA would let us know that. With the right to try, if you found that out through, I don't know, the internet or some other way, then yes, but they're not going to specifically call me and email me and say, hey, this happened to another patient, okay, whatever it was, okay? Yeah. So last I checked, right to try, it's incredibly rare in ALS, and I have seen 2 cases that got approved through right to try. It's incredibly rare and incredibly hard to get off the ground. Yeah.
When you say that got approved, like who's approving it? The drug company and the doc?
The drug company and the doc. And they actually still have to submit a form to the FDA saying they're doing it. But the FDA says, okay, you're doing it. We're standing back. We don't have to monitor. We don't have to do any of this. You've taken us out of the realm. You just kind of filed this form in their bucket, in their file cabinet, so to speak.
So it's like a patient who comes in and says, I want to try this. And then the doctor has to...
I call the pharmaceutical company and I say, hey, this patient wants to do this. Do you have enough drug to do this? Then we have to kind of go through similar regulatory issues still on my end because I still have a research arm with my institution. So I have an institutional research board or an IRB that any research that goes through me has to go through. And most institutions have an IRB for research. So I still have to do my portion of that research and go through that IRB process, but not the feds. Yeah. Great questions. Making sure I covered everything. Yeah. Okay. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about some good questions that you should ask before you enroll in a study. One, how long will it last? Okay, what happens if I can't do this anymore? Okay, I can totally get here on my own right now, but what if that isn't possible? If I don't have a ride, if I can no longer make it to the clinic, where does it actually take place? Does it all take place in one clinic? Are some of the trial monitoring by phone, or do I have to show up for each and every clinic visit? What are the risks? What happens? What do we know about this experimental drug? What are the risks to participating? What is the risk for even the route? Okay, so sometimes, an IV, it can cause an infection. A spinal tap can cause some unpleasant adverse reactions, and stem cell research, that can have some implications as well. Will I get a medicine am I guaranteed a medicine? Okay, a lot of these clinical trials, as I said, is a double-blind, placebo-controlled. So in that, both myself, double-blind means I do not know what you got. If Jessie got, I gave her a pink pill, I don't know what's in it. It could be the placebo or not. I give Jeff a pink pill, I don't know if it is or not.
I don't need pink pills.
Pink pills. No, you like blue pills, you like purple pills. I don't know any colors of the pills anymore. So, but the biotech company also doesn't know. Okay, so that's what it means to be double blind. Both the physician and the research arm does not know which packet of medication they got. What a placebo-controlled means is that we give a drug and we give a placebo, and we're monitoring what happens with both of those patient cohorts. So in a lot of these historical clinical trials, how am I with time? Oh man, I'm running out. We were seeing that, in 50% of the patients, they weren't getting any medication, and that's where we've kind of flipped the script with the platform trial, which I'll try to talk about. So I did not expect to talk this long. I thought I would be short on time, or long on time, so I will try to speed up. But will I continue to keep seeing my doctors? Do I need to have health insurance to be part of this study? Will I be reimbursed? This takes time and travel, and parking fees are not nominal these days. What else? And will you tell me the results of the study? And can you tell me if I was actually taking the study drug after the medication finishes? I'm going to speed through this a little bit since we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to get to our studies at the Lehigh Valley Health Network and how the platform trial differs from historical studies, because I think it's really important to learn about this. But I want to go back to some other options. So what if I don't want to do clinical research? What if observational studies? There's an ALS registry. So there's a national ALS registry, which is a CDC program that collects information for people living with ALS. And that's so that researchers like myself can go and get some data sets and see what are the risk factors and identify other areas for future research. So we're looking, okay, was this person involved in military? What was their work history like? Things like that, so we can better form research programs in the future and design clinical trials, okay? And so this is really a really great source for people who can't do research on such a regular basis, but they can log in and kind of fill out some surveys and say, this is me. I worked as a steel worker up at Bethlehem Steel for 22 years. Maybe there's some sort of relationship there with ALS. I'm not saying there is, but let's learn more about that. So there's at least 18 surveys last I checked, and this is a great way to just be involved in research from a low level. So, this one was the biorepository that's part of the arm of the ALS region. So we collect, you can actually donate some biosamples. There's a cheek swab that you can give. And so these are held, there's over 1,500 samples. And we as researchers can say, hey, I want to look at this and go to the biorepository to look at these samples and to do some preclinical markings to see what should our next targets be. So it's another easy way to get involved. This is our double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial here at Lehigh Valley Health Network. It's called the Combat ALS trial, and there is a sponsored EAP program through this that we're also involved in. So this is one of these, it's a phase 2/3 trial, okay? And it's at about 19 hospitals across the country, and it is using Adudablast, and it goes on for about 12 months. And at the end of the 12 months, participants or patients have the option to remain on the trial for an additional 6 months where they will be in an open label phase. And what that means is no longer will you be every patient, no longer will you be either getting the placebo or the drug, every patient will receive the drug at that open label phase. So the double blind comes off after those 12 months, and in after the 12 months, you can continue on and be sure that you are getting the medication that we're looking at as an experimental target, okay? There's a lot of office visits and clinic visits between, but we do offer this up at the Lehigh Valley Health Network. The last thing I want to kind of bring up is the Healy ALS platform trial, which is a really novel, new trial. And so this is through the Sean Healy Center for ALS up at Mass General, and it's in partnership with Tackle ALS. And what this is doing is it's a completely different way to do trials. So instead of having a head-to-head trial, we are trying to shortcut the start of clinical trials and the regulatory things. So we have sent all our regulatory information to the FDA at the beginning. And we said, okay, we're going to do this trial that involves more than one drug. We're going to shortcut this, and we're going to add on drug after drug after drug. As soon as we figure out a new target, we're going to keep adding them to the same trial that's just going to perpetually go on. We're going to take out all the regulatory hurdles of the FDA and doing more paperwork and doing all this burden here. So what they did was they initially had all of these biotech companies say, hey, do you have any targets for ALS? Submit them our way, and they identified the great people up at Mass General identified a couple different targets, and we're up to regimen G in the Healy ALS trial. So how does this differ is that it reduces the research costs because we're not doing all of the regulatory hurdles over and over and over again. So we decrease costs by about 30%. It's about 50% faster because we're not starting a trial each time, we're kind of perpetually adding on. So how does this really work? So you'll start this trial and we'll think of a medication. We thought of the first one was regimen A, and some of the patients received a placebo and some received regimen A. And as this goes on, okay, they go through their time in the research problem, and then regimen B comes out, and we add more patients to this. And the placebo arm stays the same. And so it's actually not a 50% placebo, where half of the people are getting the drug and half of the people are getting a placebo, but it's actually a 4-to-1 split. So only a quarter of the patients are getting a placebo, and the other patients are getting a drug. It could be from regimen A or B or C. Most times we're starting with one regimen at a time, and as that closes, the next one begins, okay? And right now we're at the close of one and the beginning of the other, just to let you know for regimen G. So this is a really, really exciting new idea because it eliminates that gaps, and it really proposes a real shortcut to finding these cures for ALS.
Dr. Romano, does
Yeah.
the exclusion and inclusion criteria change between regimens or no?
Not usually. There may be some tweaks, but generally the inclusion and exclusion criteria stay the same. Based on the medication, there was a medication that involved going through a lumbar puncture, and so with that there were some minor tweaks that we needed to do to make sure we included or excluded patients based on if they could lie down or something like that. But for generally, it is all the same, and we're keeping it all the same for that reason. This is a little bit more about the platform. I know I'm kind of going over time, so these are the medications that we have already gone through at this point, and regimen G is up and running, or soon to be. The map is where sites in the Lehigh and Delaware Valley are doing the platform trial. So I also just, again, we're really great collaborators in ALS research, and we work really well together. So if there is not a clinical trial that you are interested in at Lehigh Valley, we'll find our friends over at Hershey, we'll find our friends down at Jeff, we'll find our friends at Temple. But the really great thing about the platform trial is we're all working together, and there's a lot of great sites right here in the Delaware Valley. If you look on the map, we're really lucky to be part of such a great area that's doing such great research, because there are some deserts out there where there's not a lot of clinical sites doing research. General tips on internet research. So make sure it's trusted. And that's hard to find these days. I think in today's day and age, it's really hard to trust the internet anymore. There's a lot of good sleuths out there that are, making websites that look exactly like your Chase bank account, and a lot of fraudulent things. But ensure that it's a trusted website. Make sure that there's a secure link. So HTTPS, S at the end means that it's a secure. Another really good reference is that there's an ALS Untangled website, which Dr. Bedlack down at Duke runs. He's a fantastic investigator, and he has created an article that's 10 red flags and what to look at when you're looking at off-label projects and other websites. And if there's any other questions, always just ask us. We're happy to try and help you go through the maze of internet research, because it's overwhelming. Here is how you find trials. So there's a couple of different platforms that are available. Clinicaltrials.gov is a great comprehensive database, but it is clunky, man. It is a government website, so it is clunky. So there's actually a great, I think it's a part of Neil's. There's a website that actually will tell you how to go about looking and plugging in things to find on clinicaltrials.org. Because if you know the key phrases to look for, it's fantastic. But if you're not a researcher and you don't know exactly what word to use, it can be really an effort and frustration. So the Neil's website is a great website. They have an article about even how to look for that. There's an ALS trial navigator, which is a lot more user-friendly, and that can help you find some clinical trials. The Neil's website, so the Neil stands for the Northeast ALS Consortium, and that provides information on ALS trials and studies. ALS Signal and the Les Turner Foundation as well is a really good one to just understand more about research. If you're still confused after this talk, you can read from the Les Turner. It's a great website to kind of just learn more about research in general. So if I had more time, we would go through all of these different slides of clinical trials and Neil's and ALS Untangled. But we have now run out of time. But I really thank you for your time and participation.